Okay, there's still some material left from this paper, but maybe I'll finish it in one podcast without making it too long. So here we are going to look at evidence of adaptation by sector and region. The overall profile across global sectors and regions indicates that evidence for transformational adaptation is low. We found no sector or region with evidence of a high overall transformational evidence and few with evidence of medium levels of transformational adaptation. Evidence across some sectors and regions was insufficient for assessment. Transformational adaptation does not imply adequacy of adaptation to reduce risk, which is currently not methodologically feasible or available in the literature. Transformational adaptation here is based on the assessment of the scope, speed, depth, and challenges to adaptation limits, hard and soft, of responses reported in the academic literature. So you can read their supplementary material for the methodology. So here are the regions again: North America, Europe, Asia, Australasia, Africa, South America, and small island states. The color codes correspond to evidence of transformational adaptation being high, medium, low, or insufficient information and low confidence. So what are the sectors again? We are looking at the dimension of overall extent, depth, scope, speed, and limits, and we are looking at cities, food sectors in terms of cities, food, health, oceans, poverty, terrestrial, and water. So that's repeated as a phase space for all regions, and you can see that maybe there are more medium level evidence for transformational adaptation by region and sector in North America, which is not surprising, but Europe seems to worry a lot more about oceans than cities, food, etc., and also terrestrial, so that does say something. Asia has very few darker green colors, so evidence is generally low for transformational adaptation by region and sector. Similar for Australasia, Africa. This is not surprising. I'm surprised here. India has so many adaptation studies and China does too, but actual adaptation is not that transformational. South and Central America, on the other hand, have plenty of darker greens with medium evidence for transformational adaptation. Moving forward, 8 key priorities for global adaptation research. I will not read all the text. So, assess effectiveness of adaptation response. Throughout the World Bank report that we first started with in terms of adaptation principles, we talked about screening questions, indicators, metrics for evaluating progress, and monitoring and reporting and so on. This is similar, assessing effectiveness of adaptation response. So in the literature, few studies attempt to assess outcome measures, but that's critical for national adaptation plans and for effective adaptation itself. Enhance understanding of limits to adaptation and adaptation adequacy. We talked about risks that are acceptable and not acceptable. So adaptation adequacy has to be measured again by indicators and metrics to see whether they are reducing risks and vulnerabilities and enhancing resilience and so on. So there is a need to enhance the understanding of limits to adaptation. So investigation of adaptation limits remains underdeveloped within adaptation research, yet it is important to track if and how implemented adaptation addresses or approaches limits, that is, whether it's adequate in the face of climate change. Right? Seems obvious, yet it's not always done. So adaptation implementation is a good thing. It's good that so many efforts have been made to adapt, but if they don't reduce risk, then essentially you have wasted time and resources, and you have waited for climate risk to potentially increase, and the cost of implementing adaptation keeps going if you keep delaying action, either intentionally or unintentionally. Okay, Next recommendation, enable individuals and society. So we looked under the in the beginning of the course about facilitating firms and people to adapt, and we talked about protecting infrastructure and public services. All those things come under this umbrella of enabling individuals and civil societies. Okay, so much global adaptation discourse focuses on institutional adaptation and addressing governance barriers with a focus on formal institutions and state actors, but you also need to go after individuals and civil societies. Next, including missing places, scholars, and scholarship. So adaptation research is notably greater in Africa and Asia, consistent with global areas of greatest climate vulnerability. However, important gaps remain, which include Central and South America, Central Asia, Central and North Africa, and the Middle East, where vulnerability is high, but adaptation research is comparatively sparse. So either countries are rich, let's say like Saudi Arabia, and feels very confident about dealing with climate change. Maybe the case also in North America and Europe, as we saw. So Africa and South America, on the other hand, is great that they are paying attention and making adaptations, but they also have to avoid maladaptation and so on. Understand private sector responses. There is relatively little academic literature that assesses the responses within the private sector. This is a critical missing research and publications. Improve methods to synthesize different forms of evidence. Assess adaptation at different temperature thresholds. This is very critical because we are having a bit of a tunnel vision on this global warming targets of 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C, knowing probably fully well that 1.5 degrees C is pretty much guaranteed to be crossed, transcended, and exceeded. 2 degrees C, unless some game changers come along in carbon capture and energy and so on, that may also cross. So it's very critical that we know local and regional risks to which we have to adapt and assess adaptation at different temperature thresholds. It's not clear the models right now being used by IPCC for the assessment are capable of producing such local regional effect, or be very sure of what happens at 2 degrees C, let alone tell the difference between 1.5 degrees C warming and 2 degrees C warming. So these can be very severe handicaps for adaptation, especially for the global south. Improve inclusion of timescale and dynamics of responses. To read a bit here, greater understanding is needed on the durability of documented adaptation responses, how long it takes for their benefits to accrue, and to whom they accrue. Such longitudinal understanding would help inform policies at various scales about the responses available now, those that need to be planned, and synergies or trade-offs between various types of responses over time. Okay? Should I read a bit more? Maybe. For instance, are the documented benefits maintained over time as hazards, vulnerability, and exposure continue to change, or do different groups begin to win and lose? So you don't want to have global warming itself creating winners and losers, and then adaptation also adding to the pain by creating winners and losers. Okay? Let's just read the discussion at the end of this paper. Ultimately, adaptation intends to reduce the adverse effects of climate change and in some cases to take advantage of new opportunities. Although results find widespread documentation of adaptation-related responses in the academic literature, there is little evidence as to whether the responses are reducing climate risk. We identified only 1,682 articles that met our inclusion criteria from more than 48,000, which highlights that only a small fraction of the broader adaptation literature reports on implemented adaptation responses. There are also concerning gaps that arise from our results, such as a relative scarcity of reported transformative adaptation in cases for which the current and projected risks are high, and a lack of evidence that will get it wrong, and the lack of evidence that well-documented limits to adaptation are being challenged or overcome. So we are stopping well before hitting either soft or hard limitations to adaptation. These knowledge gaps reflect the substantial and recognized difficulties involved in measuring the actual and responding to observed risks and potential and responding to projected risks. So actual and potential effectiveness of a wide range of adaptation responses. The absence of evidence of risk reduction in the academic literature that documents implemented adaptation actions does not necessarily imply that no risk reduction is taking place. It's just that they didn't go and quantify it. Adaptation actions are documented beyond the academic literature as well. For example, in the gray literature, it's possible that there is more evidence of risk reduction in these other literatures. So to evaluate that literature is an important next step for global adaptation stock taking. Global adaptation stock taking is very critical as well to see if as humanity we are increasing our resilience, protecting biodiversity and other species and so on. We conducted an internal expert elicitation exercise to assess confidence in the extent to which our results reflect real-world trends in the evidence for transformational adaptation, which highlights reporting bias but broadly supports a pattern of low overall evidence on transformational adaptation. You can look up the supplementary material. The absence of empirical evidence on risk reduction that we identified in our database was not just a matter of delay. Whoops, I kind of cut out the final bit of the text there, but you get the idea that lots of papers referring to adaptation sectorally and regionally, but not all of them quantify risk, and many times there is not enough evidence that or the evidence is low and medium at best to say that transformational adaptation has happened. Okay, so let me leave this here and come back and look at adaptation implementations in dealing with compound events. We will see what those are and what the adaptations are. That's another stock take paper. That's a separate one, so we'll come back and do that. Okay.